The wind did not just blow across the high plains in the late autumn of 1878. It scoured them. It was a physical weight, a relentless presence that stripped the topsoil from the earth and the hope from a man's bones. It carried the taste of alkali and the grit of a drought that had turned the grasslands into a brittle, gray carpet that crumbled under the hoof of a horse. Elias Thorne stood by the south fence of his claim, watching the horizon where the sky met the earth in a haze of brown dust. He was 32 years old, but the sun and the wind had carved lines into his face that belonged to a man 20 years his senior. He wore a coat that had been patched 3 times at the elbow, and his hat was pulled low to shield eyes that had seen too much dry earth and too few rain clouds. The fence post in front of him was rotted at the base. He kicked it, watching it wobble, and felt the familiar dull ache of futility in his chest. It was the same ache he felt when he looked at the creek, which was now nothing more than a muddy trickle winding through cracked mud plates. It was the same ache he felt when he looked at the ribs of his cattle, protruding like the staves of a barrel. Survival here was not a triumph. It was merely a delay of the inevitable. Elias turned back toward his cabin, a small, dark structure of rough-hewn logs that seemed to huddle against the vastness of the prairie. Inside, it was silent. It had been silent for 3 years, ever since the fire. The memory of that night did not come to him in flashes anymore. It was a constant, low-grade fever in his blood. He remembered the smell of coal oil, the sudden roar of ignition, and the screaming of horses. He remembered the way the barn had turned into a skeleton of orange light against the black sky. And he remembered Caleb, who had been his partner, his friend, the man who had laughed at the impossible odds of this country. Caleb had run back in to save the stock. He had not come out. Elias had rebuilt, or tried to, but the guilt had settled into the land itself. Neighbors, few as they were, kept their distance. To them, Elias was the man who had survived when the better man had died. When he rode into the settlement of Bitter Creek for supplies, the shopkeeper took his coin with a flat stare, and the women pulled their children closer. He was a man marked by bad luck, and in the West, bad luck was contagious. The drought had made everything worse. It turned neighbors into wolves. Men guarded their water rights with shotguns, and cattle found wandering on the wrong side of a fence were shot rather than returned. Rumors began to drift in with the dust. Travelers spoke of a band of indigenous people, a splinter group of the Arapaho, or perhaps the Cheyenne, moving through the Badlands to the west. They were said to be guarding a hidden spring in a narrow pass, a place where the water still ran deep and cold. The settlers spoke of them with a mixture of fear and contempt, calling them savages and thieves. But the traders, men who moved between the worlds with no loyalty to either, whispered a different truth. They said the tribe was starving. They said the soldiers had pushed them off the buffalo ranges, and the drought had taken the rest. Elias looked at his herd. There were only 40 head left, and they were dying. Their tongues were swollen, their eyes dull. If he did not find water soon, he would have nothing. And if he had nothing, the guilt that kept him alive, the obligation to make something of this land for Caleb's memory, would finally consume him. He saddled his horse, a roan gelding named Blue. The next morning, before the sun had fully crested the eastern ridge, he packed a canteen that was only half full, a small sack of dried beef, and his Winchester rifle. He told himself it was necessity. A man had to water his stock. It was not greed to want to keep a living thing alive. But as he tightened the cinch, he knew he was lying. He was riding toward the Badlands because he was desperate, and desperation made men do things that looked a lot like madness. He rode west, away from the settlement, away from the known markers of his world. The grass thinned out, replaced by sagebrush and twisted juniper. The ground became harder, rising into broken bluffs of red and ochre stone. The heat, even in late autumn, was oppressive. It radiated from the rocks, baking the moisture out of the air. By noon, the landmarks had changed. The familiar peaks were behind him, and ahead lay a labyrinth of canyons and shadows. He was in disputed territory now. This was land that the treaties said belonged to the tribes, but the treaties were paper, and paper burned easily. Elias found tracks near a dry wash, unshod ponies, travois marks dragging in the sand. They were fresh. He should have turned back. Every instinct he had, every story he had heard about the brutality of the frontier, screamed at him to turn Blue around and ride until the horse lathered. He kept going. He licked his cracked lips and nudged the horse forward. The ambush did not happen with a war whoop. There was no thunder of hooves, no cinematic charge. It happened with the cold efficiency of a predator snapping its jaws. Elias was guiding Blue through a narrow cut in the rock, his eyes scanning the rim for the rumored spring. He heard the click of a hammer being cocked. It was a small sound, dry and mechanical, but in the silence of the canyon, it sounded like a thunderclap. He froze. "Get down," a voice said. It was not English, but the motion of the rifle barrel emerging from the brush made the meaning clear. Elias raised his hand slowly. He looked up. 2 men stood on the ledge above him. They were gaunt, their ribs showing through their deerskin vests, but their eyes were sharp and hard. Another man stepped out from behind a boulder directly in front of him. He held an old army repeater, the woodstock scarred and taped. "Water," Elias said, his voice rasping. "I am just looking for water." The man in front did not blink. He stepped forward and grabbed Blue's bridle. In one fluid motion, he yanked the horse's head down. Another man appeared at Elias's stirrup, grabbing his coat and hauling him out of the saddle. Elias hit the ground hard. The dust puffed up around him, choking him. He tried to scramble up, his hand reaching for the knife at his belt, but a moccasined foot kicked his wrist, sending a jolt of pain up his arm. The knife skittered away across the stones. They did not beat him. They did not yell. They simply overwhelmed him with numbers and dehydration. They bound his hands behind his back with rawhide thongs that cut into his skin. They took his rifle, his knife, and his canteen. The man with the repeater took a long drink from the canteen, watching Elias with flat, dark eyes, then poured the rest onto the thirsty ground. It was a cruelty that stung worse than a blow. They forced him to walk. The journey into the camp took hours. Elias stumbled over loose shale and thorny brush, his boots sliding on the steep inclines. The sun hammered the back of his neck. His tongue felt like a piece of felt in his mouth. The camp was hidden in a deep bowl of the canyon, invisible until they were right on top of it. It was not the romantic image of the noble savage that the dime novels in the East liked to peddle. It was a place of desperation. Smoke hung low and heavy, stinging the eyes. The lodges were patched with mismatched hides and canvas stolen from wagons. Elias saw the people as he was shoved through the center of the encampment. They watched him with a silence that was louder than screaming. He saw elders sitting by dying fires, their skin hanging loose on their frames. He saw women scraping hides with dull tools, their movements slow and exhausted. But it was the children that chilled him. They did not run. They did not play. They sat in the dirt, too quiet, their eyes huge and dark, watching the white man who represented the people who had taken their buffalo and their river. He was brought before the largest lodge. A man sat there on a buffalo robe, cleaning a knife with a slow, rhythmic motion. This was the war chief. He was a man of perhaps 50 winters, his hair streaked with gray, his face a map of deep creases. He wore a simple shirt of calico, stained and faded, and leggings of buckskin. There were no feathers, no paint, just the weight of authority and the heavy burden of keeping his people alive one more day. The captors forced Elias to his knees. The chief looked up. His eyes were like flint. He did not speak immediately. He studied Elias as one might study a diseased animal that had wandered into the herd. "You ride far," the chief said. His English was accented but clear. "You ride where you are not welcome." "I was looking for water." Elias croaked. "My cattle are dying." "We are dying," the chief said. He gestured to the camp. "The water here is ours. The land here is ours. But you come. You always come." "I meant no harm," Elias said. The chief laughed. A dry, humorless sound. "You are the harm. You and the others. You bring the fences. You bring the sickness. You bring the soldiers." "I am alone," Elias said. "No white man is alone." The chief replied. You are all connected. Like ants. One comes, then the hill follows. He stood up, towering over Elias. He looked tired. It was a bone-deep weariness that came from fighting a war that was already lost. My scouts say we should kill you, the chief said. They say you are a spy for the blue coats. They say your death will send a message. Elias swallowed. His throat clicked. He said nothing. There was nothing to say. He was a trespasser in a starving house. But death is easy, the chief continued. He paced a small circle around Elias. And death does not feed my people. Death does not buy us time. He stopped in front of Elias and leaned down. I have a daughter, the chief said. Elias blinked, confused by the sudden shift. She is difficult, the chief said. He chose the word carefully. Among my people. There are stories about her. They say she is cursed. They say she brings the fire and the fever. The young men fear her. The old women spit when she passes. She has no husband. She will never have a husband among us. She is a burden to the tribe, and we can carry no more burdens. Elias stared at him. What are you saying? The chief's face hardened. I am offering you a trade. A life for a life. You will take her. You will make her your wife. You will take her to your house of logs, and you will keep her. Elias felt a cold shock run through him. You want me to marry her? I want her gone, the chief said brutally. And I want you to live to suffer the bargain. If you refuse, my men will stake you to the anthill, and we will watch the sun dry you into leather. This isn't a marriage, Elias protested, his voice rising. This is coercion. You can't just give a woman away like a horse. In this world, survival writes the rules, the chief snapped. Do you want to live, rancher, or do you want to die on this ground with your morality intact? Elias looked around the circle of warriors. Their hands rested on their weapons. There was no pity in their faces. Show her to me, Elias said. The chief nodded to a woman standing near the entrance of a smaller lodge set apart from the others. The woman ducked inside and emerged a moment later leading a figure. The figure was draped in a heavy blanket. Despite the heat, a veil of thick, woven cloth covered her head and face completely. She walked with a stiff, halting gait. She did not look at Elias. She did not look at anyone. The crowd parted around her, leaving a wide berth. Elias saw a mother pull her child back as the veiled woman passed. She stood 10 feet away. She was small, slight of build. Her hands were hidden beneath the blanket. That is her, the chief said. Her name is Nady, but you will call her wife. Why is she veiled? Elias asked. The chief ignored the question. Tomorrow, when the sun is high, you will speak the words. You will take her, and if you ever return her, if you ever cast her out, my scouts will find you, and they will not be kind. Elias was dragged away to a small, isolated shelter on the edge of the camp. They tied his hands to a center post. He was given a ladle of water, which he drank greedily, spilling it down his chin. Night fell. The wind picked up, scraping across the dry earth with a sound like sandpaper. Elias sat in the darkness, his shoulders aching. He thought of his cabin. He thought of the silence there. He thought of the fire. He realized then that nobody was coming for him. There was no sheriff, no cavalry, no neighbor who would notice he was gone for days. He was entirely alone. Through the gap in the lodge flap, he saw a figure standing by the dying embers of a fire. It was the veiled woman. She was alone. The guard assigned to her sat 20 paces away, his back turned, as if looking at her was painful. She stood rigid. She brought a hand out from under the blanket to adjust the veil. In the firelight, Elias saw the hand clearly. It was scarred. The skin was shiny and tight. The fingers curled slightly inward as if the tendons had been shortened. It was a hand that had known terrible heat. She took a breath, and even from this distance, Elias could see her shoulders rise and fall rapidly, shallow and sharp. She was terrified. She was a woman surrounded by her own kin, yet treated like a leper. Elias closed his eyes. He wondered what kind of sin required such a penance. The morning of the ceremony was gray and cold. A low fog clung to the canyon floor. The tribe gathered, but there was no feasting. There were no drums of celebration. The mood was heavy, like a funeral. Elias was untied and brought to the center of the camp. His wrists were raw and bloody. He stood before the chief. The veiled woman stood next to him. She smelled of sage smoke and something else, something medicinal and sharp, like old sorrow. She was trembling. He could feel the vibration of it in the air between them. The chief spoke in his own tongue first, addressing the sky in the 4 directions. Then he turned to Elias. "You take this woman," the chief said in English. "You take her curse. You take her burden. It is no longer ours. I take her," Elias said. The words tasted like ash. "Lift the veil," the chief commanded. "A husband must see his wife." Elias turned to her. She flinched as he raised his hands. It was a small movement, a pulling back of her head, but it spoke volumes. She expected to be struck. "I am not going to hurt you," Elias whispered. He reached out. His fingers brushed the rough wool of the veil. He paused for a heartbeat, looking at the covered shape of her head. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he lifted the fabric and folded it back. Time seemed to stop. Elias froze. His breath caught in his throat. The woman's face was a map of agony. The left side was smooth, pale, with an eye that was dark and intelligent. But the right side was a ruin. Severe burn scars twisted the skin from her temple down to her jawline, pulling the corner of her mouth into a permanent, tight grimace. The ear was gone, replaced by a knot of healed tissue. The skin was mottled, pink and white and angry red. A landscape of melted flesh that had healed but never truly recovered. It was the signature of fire. Elias stared. He knew this damage. He had seen it on the livestock he had shot to put out of their misery. He had seen it on the blackened beams of his barn. A memory slammed into him. The night of the fire 3 years ago. The wind had been blowing hard, just like today. The sparks from his burn pile had jumped the break. They had raced across the dry grass faster than a horse could run. The fire had swept toward the settlement, toward the trader's outpost where the local tribe sometimes camped to barter. He had thought the fire died out in the creek bed. He had never gone to check. He had been too busy burying Caleb. He looked at her. She was young, perhaps 20. 3 years ago, she would have been 17. She was looking at him with her one good eye, and the damaged one which could not fully close. She was bracing herself. She was waiting for the recoil. She was waiting for the look of disgust that she had seen 1,000 times. Elias felt the instinct to pull back. It was natural. The human mind rejected deformity, but he caught himself. He looked at her eye, the one that was steady and terrified. He saw the human being trapped behind the scar tissue. He realized that if he recoiled now, he would kill whatever spirit she had left. He forced his face to remain still. He forced his hands to lower the veil gently to her shoulders, leaving her face exposed to the air but framing it with a strange sort of dignity. She blinked, surprised. The chief watched them closely. "She is your life now," the chief said, his voice dropping to a low growl. "If you harm her, we kill you. If you abandon her on the prairie, we kill you. If you shame her, if you let others mock her and do nothing, we kill you." Elias looked at the chief. He understood now. This was not just getting rid of a curse. This was protection. The chief could not protect her from the scorn of his own people, who saw her as a bad omen. But he could force a white man, a man already guilty, to be her shield. It was a punishment for Elias, yes, but it was a desperate, twisted act of love for the daughter. "I understand," Elias said. The chief signaled to his men. 2 horses were brought forward. One was blue. His saddlebags returned but lighter. The other was a spotted mare, small but sturdy. "Go," the chief said. "Do not look back." Elias mounted Blue. His body ached. He felt lightheaded from hunger. He looked down at the woman, his wife. She struggled to mount the mare, her scarred hand gripping the mane clumsily. No one helped her. Elias nudged Blue closer. He reached out and grabbed her arm to steady her. She froze at his touch, her muscles hard as rock. "Easy," he said softly. She pulled herself up. She adjusted her blanket to hide her face again. pulling the veil forward until only her eyes were visible. They rode out of the canyon in silence. The warriors watched them go, standing like stone sentinels on the ridges. They rode for hours, putting miles between themselves and the camp. The landscape opened up, turning from red rock back to the gray, wind-scoured grasslands. The sky was vast and indifferent, a pale blue dome that cared nothing for the two small figures crawling across its floor. Elias looked at the woman riding beside him. She sat slumped, her head bowed against the wind. They were strangers. They were enemies by birth, bound by a threat and a ceremony of words neither of them chose. He looked at his own hands on the reins. They were shaking. He was alive, but he wasn't free. He had traded a quick death for a slow, complicated one. He looked at the horizon. The drought was still there. The town was still there. The prejudice and the hatred were waiting for them. And he was bringing a cursed woman into the heart of it. He felt a heavy stone of dread settle in his stomach. But as he glanced at her again, seeing the way she held the reins with her scarred hand, he felt something else too, a strange, dark recognition. They were both ruined people. And now, for better or worse, they belonged to the road ahead. "Let's go home," he said to the wind. She did not answer, but she turned the spotted mare to follow him as he struck north, toward the ranch, toward the winter, and toward a life that terrified them both. The ranch was nothing more than a scatter of gray timber huddled against the vast, bruising sky. As Elias Thorne and the veiled woman rode through the gate, the wind kicked up a cloud of grit that rattled against the dry boards of the barn. It was a bleak kingdom, defined by what it lacked: water, comfort, and mercy. Elias reined Blue in near the corral. Two men emerged from the shadows of the barn, shielding their eyes against the sun. They were his hired hands, the only two who had stayed when the pay got thin and the water got thinner. Silas was the older of the two, a man with a beard like steel wool and a spine bent by 40 years of saddle work. Grady was younger, barely 20, with a face that still held the soft edges of boyhood, but eyes that had learned to be hard. They stopped dead when they saw the second horse. They saw the figure wrapped in the blanket, the face hidden behind the thick weave of the veil. "Who is that?" Silas asked. He did not step forward to take the reins. Elias dismounted. His boots hit the dust with a heavy thud. He felt the exhaustion in his knees, a bone-deep ache that had nothing to do with the ride. "This is my wife," Elias said. The silence that followed was louder than the wind. Grady's mouth opened, then snapped shut. Silas squinted, his gaze shifting from Elias to the woman on the spotted mare. "Your wife," Silas repeated. He said the word like it was a foreign coin he suspected was counterfeit. "Since when?" "Since 2 days ago," Elias said. He walked to the mare and reached up to help her down. She did not take his hand. She slid off the saddle on her own, landing lightly, though he saw her knees buckle slightly before she locked them straight. She stood there, a strange, dark shape in the bright yard, the veil fluttering around her shoulders. Silas took a step back, wiping his hands on his trousers. "Is she Indian?" "She is from the camp in the Badlands," Elias said. He began to unsaddle Blue, his movements sharp and angry. He did not want to explain. He did not want to see the look that was forming on their faces. Grady let out a short, nervous laugh. "You brought a squaw here? Boss, they're starving. They're raiding folks. You bring one here. You bring the whole tribe down on us." "She isn't a raid," Elias said, tossing the heavy saddle onto the rail. "She is my wife. Her name is Nadie. She got a face under that rag?" Grady asked, stepping closer, curiosity warring with his prejudice. Elias turned. The motion was fast, a sudden release of the tension that had been coiling inside him for 48 hours. "Back off. Grady." "I'm just asking," Grady said, raising his hands but sneering. "Why's she hide it? She got the pox? She a leper?" Silas spat into the dust. I heard talk about a woman over there. Cursed, they say. Bringing fire, bringing sickness. You bring a curse onto this land, Elias, and the drought ain't gonna be the thing that kills us. Elias walked over to them. He stopped 2 feet from Silas. He was not a big man, but in that moment, he felt dangerous. "This is the way it is," Elias said, his voice low and flat. "She lives here. She eats at my table. Nobody touches her, nobody insults her, nobody spreads stories about her when they go into town for whiskey. And if we do," Grady challenged, though his eyes darted away. "Then you ride," Elias said, "and you ride without your back pay." Silas stared at him for a long moment, chewing on his tobacco. Then he shook his head. "You're a damn fool, Elias, a lonely damn fool. But it's your funeral." The men turned and walked back into the barn, muttering. Elias stood in the wind, feeling the isolation settle around him like a second skin. He turned to Nadie. She had not moved. She stood near the mare, her head bowed, her hands hidden beneath her blanket. She had heard every word. She knew exactly what she was. A trespasser, a threat, a monster. "Come on," Elias said. He led her to the cabin. It was a single room with a loft, built of pine logs chinked with mud. Inside, it smelled of stale coffee, wood smoke, and the musty scent of a bachelor's life. There was a cast-iron stove in the corner, a table with 2 mismatched chairs, and a narrow bed covered in a buffalo robe. He opened the door and stood back. She hesitated on the threshold. She looked at the dark interior as if it were a cage. Then, with a shallow intake of breath, she stepped inside. Elias closed the door, shutting out the wind. The silence in the room was immediate and suffocating. "You can put your things there," he said, pointing to a wooden chest at the foot of the bed. She did not move. She stood in the center of the room, turning slowly, looking at the walls, the rifle on the rack, the small window that let in a square of gray light. She looked trapped. Elias took off his hat and ran a hand through his dirty hair. He felt a sudden surge of resentment. He had not asked for this. He had gone for water and come back with a ghost. He looked at her, this silent, veiled burden, and he hated the chief for forcing this on him. Then he looked at the rigid line of her shoulders, the way she held her breath, and he hated himself for the resentment. She had had less choice than he did. "I'll sleep on the floor," he said. She turned her head toward him. The veil shifted. "The bed is yours." He continued, "I have plenty of blankets. I'll make a pallet by the stove." She did not speak. She simply nodded. Once. That first night was an exercise in tension. Elias lay on a pile of blankets near the stove, staring at the dark beams of the ceiling. The wind howled outside, rattling the shutter. Across the room, on the bed, Nadie lay perfectly still. She had not removed her clothes. She had not removed her boots. She had curled onto the mattress like a feral thing expecting to be kicked. Elias knew she was awake. He could hear the rhythm of her breathing. Too fast, too shallow. He knew, without looking, that she had a knife. He had seen the shape of it under her sash. She was waiting for him to come to her. She was waiting for the payment the chief had promised. "I am not coming over there," Elias said into the dark. The breathing stopped for a second, then resumed. "Sleep?" he said. She did not sleep. Neither did he. The days that followed fell into a brittle routine. The ranch did not pause for trauma or ceremony. There were fences to mend, cattle to push toward the remaining patches of dry grass, and wood to be chopped. Elias expected her to hide in the cabin. He expected her to be helpless, a creature of the lodge who did not understand the tools of a settler. He was wrong. On the second morning, he came back from the barn to find her outside. She was at the wood pile. She had found the axe. She was swinging it with a grim, practiced efficiency. She did not swing with her shoulders, but with her back and hips, splitting the knotty pine with clean, sharp strokes. He stopped and watched her. She was still veiled, the fabric tied back slightly to allow her to see the wood. She wore a man's work shirt she must have found in the trunk, cinched at the waist with a rope. She moved like someone who was used to working while exhausted. She moved like someone who expected to be watched and blamed if the work was not done. She saw him and stopped mid-swing. She lowered the axe immediately, stepping back, her head lowering. "You don't have to do that," Elias said. Wood is needed, she said. Her voice was raspy, unused. It was the first time she had spoken since the wedding. I can do it, he said. You have cattle, she replied. She did not look at him. She picked up a split log and stacked it against the wall. The stack was perfectly square, tight and stable. Elias watched her for a moment longer, then nodded. Keep the axe sharp. Then, the stone is in the shed. He turned and walked toward the pasture. He felt a strange shifting in his chest. She was not a guest. She was not a prisoner. She was a hand. And on this land, a hand was worth more than a wife. But the ranch hands were not so easily won. Silas and Grady gave her a wide berth, crossing themselves when she passed. They would not eat in the cabin anymore. They took their beans and coffee out to the bunkhouse, muttering about witchery. Elias tried to ignore it, but the poison was in the air. One evening, he sat at the table mending a bridle. Nadie was at the stove, stirring a pot of stew. She had taken over the cooking without asking, and the food was simple but better than anything Elias had made for himself. He watched her back. She was tense. She flinched every time the wood in the stove popped. If he shifted in his chair, she froze, her head tilting slightly as if calculating the distance between them. She had learned to expect harm even from the quiet. Nadie, he said. She spun around. The wooden spoon raised like a weapon. The stew splashed onto the hot iron, hissing. He held up his hands. Just the salt. I was going to ask for the salt. She lowered the spoon slowly. She reached for the crock and placed it on the table, sliding it toward him without touching his hand. Thank you, he said. She went back to the stove. Why do you wear it inside? He asked. The veil. The silence stretched. It is better, she said. Better for who? For you, she answered. Elias looked at her. He remembered the face he had seen for those few seconds in the canyon. The melted skin, the missing ear, the map of pain. I am not afraid of scars, Elias said. You are a man, she said, her back to him. Men look. Then they turn away, or they stare. I do not want to be stared at. I won't stare, he said. Eat your stew, she said, closing the subject. The outside world did not leave them alone for long. A week after they arrived, a neighbor rode up. It was Jeb Miller, a man with a smile that never reached his eyes and a tongue that wagged in every saloon within 50 miles. He came asking for the loan of a post-hole digger, but his eyes were scanning the yard, the windows, the porch. He saw her. Nadie was on the porch, shaking out a rug. She froze when she saw the rider. She dropped the rug and retreated into the dark of the cabin. But it was too late. Jeb whistled low. So it's true. Old Silas said you'd gone native. Elias didn't believe him. Said you brought home a squaw in a sack. She's my wife, Elias said, stepping off the porch, his hand resting near his hip. Wife, Jeb chuckled. That's a word for it. I guess. You know what folks are saying? They're saying you lost your mind out in the heat. They're saying she's one of those fire starters. That tribe, they say she's bad luck walking. She's my wife, Elias repeated, his voice harder. And you can get off my land. Jeb held up his hands, grinning. No need to get riled, just neighborly concern. But I'd watch your barn. Elias, fire follows that kind. He turned his horse and rode off, the dust settling in his wake. Elias knew that by sundown, the story would be in Bitter Creek by Sunday. The preacher would be using it in his sermon. He went inside. Nadie was standing in the corner, pressed into the shadows. She was shaking. He's gone, Elias said. He will talk. She whispered, let him talk. Talk brings men, she said. Men bring torches. Elias looked at her. He saw the genuine terror in her posture. This was not paranoia. This was memory. I won't let them, he said. He began to leave small things for her, practical kindnesses. He noticed her boots were worn through, so he found an old pair of his, stuffed the toes with wool, and left them by the bed. He brought in a bucket of fresh water from the pump so she wouldn't have to carry it. He did not wait for thanks. He did not want her to feel she owed him. She began to test him. It was subtle at first. One afternoon, He came back to the cabin and found the door unlatched. It was swinging in the wind. He walked in and saw her sitting on the bed, watching him. She was waiting to see if he would bolt it from the outside, if he would lock her in like a prisoner. He closed the door and latched it against the wind, but he did not slide the heavy bolt. He took off his coat and sat down. "Wind's picking up," he said. She let out a breath she had been holding. Another time, she was handing him a hammer to fix a loose board on the porch. She held it out, her wrist exposed. He reached for it. He saw her muscles tense, waiting for him to grab her arm, to pull her in, to assert the dominance that every man she had known seemed to crave. He took the hammer by the handle, his fingers brushing hers lightly, and stepped back. "Thanks," he said. She watched him pound the nail, her head tilted. She was studying him like a new species of animal, one that did not bite when the hand was offered. Elias learned her language of fear. He learned that she covered her ear, the place where the ear used to be, whenever the men laughed loudly in the yard. He learned that she went perfectly still, like a rabbit in the grass, whenever she smelled smoke. And he learned that there were no mirrors in the cabin, and she kept the window glass covered with a cloth when the sun hit it right. A traveling trader came through 2 weeks later. He was a man named Frenchy, a peddler who sold pots and pans and gossip. He watered his mules at Elias's trough. "You have the girl," Frenchy said, packing his pipe, "the one they call the cursed daughter." Elias tightened the cinch on his saddle. "She has a name. Oui, Nadi. But the tribe, they call her Firewalker. They say she survived a fever that killed the strong, then a fire that took the lodges, then the hunger winter. They say death walks behind her, but does not take her. It takes those she loves." "Why are you telling me this?" Elias asked. "So, you know," Frenchy said, lighting a match. The match flared, and Elias saw Nady, who was by the woodpile, drop a log and scramble backward, tripping over her own feet. Frenchy laughed. "See? She remembers. Get out," Elias said. That evening, the cabin was quiet. Elias sat by the stove, watching the flames behind the grate. Nady was mending a shirt, her needle flashing in the lantern light. "The trader," Elias said, "he talks too much. He speaks what they believe," she said without looking up. "Was it a fire?" Elias asked. "The scars." She stopped sewing. The silence stretched so thin it hummed. "Yes," she said. "How?" She did not answer for a long time. Elias thought she wouldn't. He went back to cleaning his gun, the rhythmic slide of the cloth on metal filling the room. "Fire. Took everything," she said finally. Her voice was a whisper. "It took the lodge. It took my mother. It took my face." Elias looked at his hands. They were calloused, stained with oil and dirt. "I know about fire," he said. She looked at him. 3 years ago, he said, "My partner, Caleb. We were burning brush. The wind changed. Just like that. It took the barn. It took the horses. It took him." He looked up and met her veiled gaze. "I was the one who lit the match," he said. She stared at him. For the first time, he saw something other than fear in her stance. He saw a flicker of recognition. She understood the weight of a survival that felt like a theft. They needed supplies. The flour was gone, and the coffee was dust. Going to town was unavoidable. "You're coming with me," Elias said. "No," she said, retreating to the corner. "I can't leave you here alone," he said. "Not with the hands the way they are, and not with neighbors like Jeb. You're safer with me." She rode beside him, her head wrapped tight, her body rigid. Bitter Creek was a collection of false-fronted buildings along a single muddy street. As they rode in, the activity on the street slowed. People stopped. They stared. It wasn't just curiosity. It was a heavy, predatory stillness. A woman in a bonnet, the preacher's wife, stopped on the boardwalk. She looked at Nady, then at Elias, her face twisting into a mask of poisonous pity. "Mr. Thorne." She called out, "Is this the—" "Unfortunate creature." Elias ignored her. He tied the horses at the general store. "Stay close," he muttered to Nady. They walked up the steps. A man was sitting on a barrel, smelling of stale whiskey and unwashed wool. He was a drifter, one of the many broken men the war had spit out. He squinted at Nady. "What's in the bundle?" "Friend." Elias stepped between them. "Move aside." The drunk stood up, swaying. He grinned, revealing yellow teeth. "I just want to see. They say she's a demon. They say she's got no face." He reached out, his hand, filthy and trembling, clawed for the veil. Nady let out a sharp, strangled sound and shrank back against the wall. Elias moved. He didn't think, he just reacted. He caught the man's wrist in midair. He twisted it, hard, forcing the man's arm up behind his back until the joint popped. The drunk howled. Elias slammed him face first into the wall of the store. He pressed his forearm against the man's neck, pinning him. His other hand rested on the grip of his Colt, not drawing it, but holding the thread of it. "Don't!" Elias said. His voice was not loud. It was the voice of a man who was very tired and very close to the edge. "Do not touch her. Do not look at her." He shoved the man away. The drunk stumbled and fell into the mud. The street was silent. Everyone was watching. The preacher's wife, the shopkeeper, the men loitering by the saloon. Elias took Nady's arm. His grip was firm but careful. "Come on." He bought the supplies in a cold fury, daring the shopkeeper to speak. The man weighed the flour in silence, his eyes darting to the veiled woman who stood by the door, trembling. The ride back was fast. Nady did not speak. She shook. It was a fine, continuous tremor that vibrated through the saddle. When they got inside the cabin, she collapsed. Not a faint, but a crumbling. She sat on the floor by the chest, pulling her knees to her chest, rocking. The veil was damp with her breath. Elias brought the supplies in. He barred the door. He didn't try to lift her up. He didn't tell her it was okay, because it wasn't. He sat on the floor near the door, a few feet away from her. He took out his knife and a piece of wood and began to whittle. He just sat there. He was a wall between her and the world. He stayed there for an hour. Slowly, the rocking stopped. "You stopped him," she said. Her voice was muffled. He had no right. Elias said, "Men always think they have rights." She said, "Not here." Elias said, "He shaved a curl of wood off the stick. Not with me." A few days later, the weather broke slightly. The sun came out, weak but bright. Elias was fixing a stirrup leather at the table. He fumbled with the punch, and it skittered across the table, bouncing off the edge and landing in the water bucket with a loud plip. Water splashed up, hitting Elias squarely in the face. He blinked, water dripping from his nose. He looked ridiculous. From the corner, a sound came. It was short, melodic, and startling. A laugh. Elias turned. Nady had her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide above the veil. She had laughed. It had escaped her before she could catch it. Immediately, the light vanished from her eyes. She clamped down, shrinking back. She looked terrified, as if the joy was a transgression that would bring the ceiling down on them. I am sorry," she stammered. Elias wiped his face with his sleeve. He looked at her. "Don't be," he said softly. He wanted to tell her that the sound was the best thing he had heard in 3 years, but he knew that was too much, so he just smiled, a small, crooked thing. It was a good shot. He said, "The bucket." She hesitated, then her eyes crinkled at the corners. "Just a little." That night, the air in the cabin was different. It wasn't lighter, exactly, but the tension had changed texture. It wasn't fear anymore. It was awareness. Elias lay on his pallet. Nady was on the bed. The lamp was out, but the glow from the stove cast long shadows. He heard her shift. He heard the rustle of the blanket. "Elias?" "Yeah. Why did you take the bargain?" she asked. "You could have fought. I would have died," he said. "Is that the only reason?" He thought about it. He thought about the empty cabin, the silence, the guilt that ate at him. "I was tired of being the only one left," he said honestly. She didn't answer, but a moment later, he heard her sigh, a long, releasing breath. He rolled over and looked at the outline of her on the bed. He felt a pull, an ache in his chest that had nothing to do with duty. He remembered the way she had swung the axe. He remembered her standing up to the wind. He wanted to cross the room. He wanted to sit on the edge of the bed and just be near her warmth. He didn't move. He knew that desire, for her, was a weapon men used. He would not be another weapon. But the ache stayed. The part ended not with a sunrise, but with a storm. A real high plains blizzard, coming down from the north like a white curtain. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in an hour. Elias brought extra wood in. He nailed a blanket over the window. The wind shrieked, a high demonic sound that made the timbers groan. "It's going to be a bad one," he said, dusting snow from his shoulders. Nadie was by the stove. She had taken off the veil, her back to him. She was warming her hands. "The cold is better than the fire," she said. Elias moved to stand next to her. The cabin was small. The heat from the stove created a small, intimate circle. He was close enough to smell the wood smoke in her hair, close enough to see the tension in her neck. He reached out, his hand hovering near her shoulder. He didn't touch her. He just let the warmth of his hand radiate toward her. She didn't pull away. She leaned back, just an inch, into the space he offered. They stood there as the storm buried the world outside. Two ruined people, trapped in a box of logs, listening to the wind hunt for them. For the first time, they were not looking at the door, waiting for an escape. They were looking at the fire, and at each other, and recognizing that the pain in the room was a shared language. And in that sharing, there was the terrified, fragile beginning of something that might, if they survived the winter, turn into trust. The high country spring did not arrive with a gentle greening. It arrived with the violence of a breaking fever. The snow, which had held the land in a white chokehold for months, collapsed into slush. The creeks, dry and rattling only weeks before, suddenly roared with brown, muscular water that chewed at the banks and carried away the carcasses of winter-killed deer. Elias Thorne watched the transformation from his porch. The mud was ankle-deep in the yard, a sucking, heavy clay that made every step a labor. But the grass was coming. Through the gray mat of last year's death, green spikes were pushing up, sharp and urgent. It should have been a time of relief. The cattle, thin as rails, finally had something to graze on. But with the grass came the old trouble. The herds from the southern spreads began to drift north, pushing against the invisible lines of claimed territory. Men who had huddled by their stoves all winter rode out with narrowed eyes, checking water rights and fence lines, their tempers shortened by months of cabin fever. The tension was not just between the ranchers. It was a wire pulled tight across the entire valley, vibrating with the threat of the tribe in the Badlands. 3 weeks after the thaw, the riders appeared. There were 2 of them, sitting on paint ponies on the ridge overlooking Elias's cabin. They did not come down. They simply sat there, silhouettes against the bright, hard blue of the sky. Elias was in the corral, pitching hay. He saw Nadie freeze. She was by the well, hoisting a bucket. She did not drop it, but her body went rigid, the line of her back snapping straight. She stared up at the ridge, her face hidden behind the veil she still wore whenever she stepped outside. "Go inside," Elias said quietly. She did not move. "They are watching," she said. "Who are they?" "My father's eyes," she answered. Elias walked to the fence, resting his gloved hands on the top rail. He did not reach for his rifle. He understood, with a sudden, sinking clarity, that this was not a raid. It was an inspection. The riders stayed for 10 minutes, motionless as statues. Then, with a synchronized turn of their mounts, they vanished behind the crest of the hill. "They want to know if I am dead," Nadie said. Her voice was flat, devoid of hope. "They want to know if I kept my word," Elias corrected. He turned to look at her. She had lowered the bucket, the water sloshing over the rim onto her boots. "Your father is using us," Elias said. He realized it as he spoke. "As long as you are here, as long as you are alive and fed, he can tell his young warriors that there is a bond. He can tell the soldiers that he has a treaty with a white man. You are his shield. And if I die?" she asked. "Then the shield breaks," Elias said, "and the war comes." The weight of it settled on them. They were not just a man and a woman trying to survive a hard patch of ground. They were the hinge upon which the peace of the valley swung. The pressure from the white world was less subtle. A week later, Elias rode into town for seed. The atmosphere in Bitter Creek had shifted. The winter lethargy was gone, replaced by a sharp, aggressive energy. Men stood in knots on the boardwalks, talking loudly. He ran into Clay Hatcher outside the livery. Hatcher was a big man, broad across the shoulders, with a face that flushed red easily. He ran the largest spread to the south, and he had been trying to organize a protection committee since the first snow fell. "Thorn," Hatcher called out. He stepped into Elias's path, blocking the doorway. "We missed you at the meeting last night." "I didn't know there was one," Elias said, though he suspected he had been pointedly excluded. "We're organizing," Hatcher said. "Boys are tired of losing stock, tired of wondering if they're going to wake up with their scalps on. We're putting together a rotation, patrols, checking the passes. I have my own land to worry about," Elias said, trying to step around him. "That's just it," Hatcher said, moving to block him again. His voice dropped, losing its false geniality. "Your land is the problem. Elias, you got a guest up there. She is my wife," Elias said. The words came out automatic and hard. "She is a spy," Hatcher spat. "Don't think we don't see them riders up on your ridge. They're checking in with her. She's signaling them, telling them where the weak herds are." "That is a lie," Elias said. "Is it?" Hatcher stepped closer, smelling of tobacco and sweat. "You sleep with a savage. You wake up with fleas, Thorn, but you're putting the rest of us at risk. You get rid of her, or we might decide you're part of the threat." Elias looked at Hatcher. He looked at the men watching from the porch of the hotel. He saw the same look he had seen on the faces of the tribal elders, fear masked as righteousness. "If you come onto my land," Elias said, his voice low and steady, "you ride in through the gate. If you cut my fence or threaten my house, I will treat you like any other predator." He pushed past Hatcher. He felt the eyes of the town boring into his back. He bought his seat in silence, the shopkeeper barely meeting his gaze. When he rode out, nobody waved. He was alone. The isolation he had felt for 3 years was now absolute. Back at the cabin, the silence was different. It was no longer the silence of strangers avoiding each other. It was the silence of a bunker. Nadie sensed the shift. She saw the way Elias checked the horizon before unbarring the door. She saw the way he cleaned his Winchester every night, dismantling it and oiling the action until it was slick and silent. She began to speak more. It started as a necessity, warnings about the weather, questions about the stock, but it grew into something else. One evening, while they sat by the fire mending harness leather, she pointed to the needle in his hand. "B," she said. Elias looked up. "What?" "B," she repeated. "It is the word for the metal. The needle." Elias repeated the sound. It felt strange in his mouth, guttural and soft at the same time. "B." She nodded. She pointed to the fire. "Coo, coo," Elias said. It became a quiet ritual. Every night, she gave him a word. It was a bridge she was building, plank by plank. It was an intimacy that didn't require touch, a way of letting him into her mind without exposing her body. "Why do they call you cursed?" Elias asked one night. He didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on the leather he was punching. She hesitated. The fire popped, a spark shooting against the screen. "Because they were hungry." She said. Elias waited. "After the sickness, the winter was hard." She said softly. "The buffalo were gone. The babies were crying. When people are that hungry, they get angry. They need a reason. They cannot hate the sky for not raining. They cannot hate the soldiers who have big guns. So they hate what is close." She touched her veil, her fingers tracing the line of the scar beneath. "The fire that burned me. It happened when the traders came. There was fighting, whiskey and confusion. I was trapped in the lodge. When I came out, I was broken." She took a breath, a ragged sound, to survive the fire when others died. "They said I must have traded my soul. They said I ate the luck of the tribe to save my own skin. It is easier to blame a scarred girl than to admit the world is ending." Elias set the harness down. He looked at her, seeing the terrifying logic of it. She was a vessel for their grief. "It is the same in town," Elias said. "They need a monster. If they have a monster, they don't have to look at their own greed." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the dark. "I can't promise it will get better," he said, "but I can promise that in this house. You are not a curse. You are just a woman." She did not answer, but he saw her head bow, not in shame, but in something like relief. The violence, when it came, was precise and staged. 2 days later, Elias found the fence cut in the north pasture. It wasn't just cut. The wire had been snipped clean and coiled back. 30 head of calves were gone, but it was what was left behind that made his blood run cold. 2 arrows were driven into the ground, crossing each other. A strip of red cloth, patterned like tribal weaving, was tied to a post. It was clumsy. It was theatrical. Silas and Grady rode up as Elias was staring at the arrows. "See?" Grady shouted, his face pale. "I told you, they're raiding us. They left their mark." Elias pulled the arrows from the ground. The fletching was wrong. The feathers were turkey, glued on crookedly, not bound with sinew the way the Arapaho did it. This wasn't them. Elias said, "Don't be blind." "Boss!" Silas yelled. "They took the calves. This is war. Go back to the barn," Elias ordered. "Get the rifles. Watch the house." "I ain't watching no house with that witch inside," Grady spat. "Do as I say," Elias roared, his voice cracking like a whip. "Or keep riding and never come back." The men turned their horses, muttering, and galloped toward the ranch. Elias mounted Blue. He looked toward the cabin. Nadie was standing on the porch. She had seen the commotion. He rode to her. "Get your mare," he said. She didn't ask questions. She grabbed her coat and her veil and mounted the spotted horse. They rode to the cut fence. Elias handed her the arrows. She looked at them for a second, then dropped them in the dirt with disdain. "Children's toys." She said, "Look at the tracks." Elias said. She slid off her horse and crouched in the mud. She moved with a fluidity that fascinated him. She was reading the earth like a ledger. She traced the rim of a hoofprint. "Shod," she said. "Iron shoes. The tribe has some shod horses." Elias said, "Playing devil's advocate. Stolen ones." She shook her head. She pointed to another track, deeper, made by a heavy boot. "Look at the heel," she said. Elias leaned down. The impression was clear in the drying clay. There were small, distinct indentations in the heel print. "Nails," Nadie said. "Square-headed nails, like the shopkeeper sells." She looked up at him. Her eyes were fierce above the veil. "My people wear moccasins, or boots stolen from dead soldiers. They do not wear boots with nails bought in Bitter Creek." It was white men, rustlers, maybe Hatcher's men, trying to provoke a war to clear the range, maybe just thieves taking advantage of the tension. They tracked them for 5 miles. The trail led straight toward the rocky Badlands, trying to sell the lie that the cattle had been taken to the tribe. But then, at the base of a shale ridge, the tracks turned sharp east, cutting back toward a hidden box canyon that smugglers used. They stopped. The sun was dipping low, casting long, purple shadows across the scrub. "We know," Elias said. "We cannot get the calves." Nadie said, "There are too many of them. I count 6 horses." "No," Elias said, "but we have the truth." He looked at her. Her veil was dusty, her coat stained with mud. She wasn't the trembling creature he had brought home. She was a partner. He reached out and brushed a smudge of dirt from her shoulder. It was a reflexive gesture, something a man would do for a friend. She went still. She looked at his hand, then up at his eyes. "You read the ground well," he said. "I learned to look down." She said, "It is safer than looking up." They rode back in the twilight. The air was cooling rapidly, the smell of sage and damp earth rising around them. Their knees brushed as the horses walked side by side. Neither of them pulled away. That night, the cabin felt smaller. The adrenaline of the day had burned off, leaving a raw, vibrating awareness between them. They had hunted together. They had shared a secret. The barrier of stranger was gone, leaving only the barrier of man and woman. Elias barred the door. He turned to find her watching him. She was standing by the table, her hands gripping the back of a chair. "They will blame my father anyway," She said, "We will tell the truth." Elias said, "Truth is quiet." She said, "Hate is loud." She walked around the table. She stopped 3 feet from him. She took a breath, her chest rising. She reached up and unpinned the veil. She didn't turn away. She let him look. The scars were livid in the firelight, a map of violence. But Elias didn't look at the scars. He looked at her mouth, the way her lips parted slightly. "Elias," she whispered. He felt a pull so strong it made him dizzy, but he stayed planted. He remembered the chief's bargain. He remembered the fear that lived in her bones. "Nadie," he said. His voice was rough. "I need you to know something." She waited. "I made a deal to save my life," he said, "but that deal didn't include you. Not that part of you." He gestured between them. "I am not going to claim you," he said. "I am not going to take payment for bringing you here. If anything ever happens, it will be because you want it, because you choose it, and you say it." She stared at him. She looked confused, as if he were speaking a language she hadn't taught him yet. "You are a man," she said. "You have the right." "I don't want the right," Elias said fiercely. "I want the choice." He turned and went to his pallet on the floor. He lay down, turning his back to the room, his heart hammering against his ribs. She stood there for a long time. He listened to the silence. He wondered if he had just insulted her, or saved her. 2 nights later, the wind kicked up again. A storm wasn't coming, but the air was charged, electric. They were asleep, or pretending to be. A coyote howled, close to the cabin, then another, then the sound of a horse whinnying in panic from the corral. Elias was up in a second, his rifle in his hand. He threw open the shutter. Nothing, just shadows and wind. A wolf, maybe, spooking the stock. He stood by the window for 10 minutes, watching, waiting. His pulse was thumping in his neck. The threat of the rustlers, the vigilantes, the tribe. It was all out there in the dark. He turned back to the room. Nadie was sitting up in bed. She was not wearing the veil. Her hair was loose, falling over her scarred cheek. "Is it them?" she asked. "No," Elias said. "Just a coyote." He leaned the rifle against the wall. He was shaking slightly, the adrenaline crash leaving him weak. He sat down on the edge of the hearth, rubbing his face with his hands. "God, I'm tired," he muttered. He felt a movement, a shift in the air. Nadie had gotten out of bed. She walked across the floor. Her feet were bare. She wore a simple cotton shift that shone white in the gloom. She stopped in front of him. Elias looked up. She was trembling, not with the old terror, but with something else, a need, a desperate human need to be anchored. She reached out. Her hand, the scarred one, touched his face. Her palm was rough, the skin tight, but her touch was incredibly gentle. "You are warm," she whispered. Elias closed his eyes. He leaned his cheek into her hand. The sensation was overwhelming. "Nadie," he warned softly. "I am choosing," she said. Her voice shook, but the words were clear. "I am saying it." She stepped between his knees. Elias opened his eyes. He reached up and took her waist. He didn't pull her, he just held her. He felt the heat of her body through the thin cotton. He felt the frantic beat of her heart against his chest. It wasn't a romance novel moment. It was 2 people clinging to a raft in a hurricane. She bent down and kissed him. Her lips were dry. The scarred side of her mouth was stiff, but the kiss was fierce. It tasted of fear and longing and the metallic tang of survival. Elias stood up, bringing her with him. He wrapped his arms around her, burying his face in her neck. He held her as if she might break, but she held him back with a strength that surprised him. They moved to the bed. It wasn't graceful. It was a tangle of limbs and heavy breathing, a shedding of the armor they both wore. When he touched her scars, the ridge of tissue on her shoulder, the tightness of her flank, he felt her flinch. He stopped. He waited. He kept his hand there, warm and still, until the muscle relaxed, until she understood that his touch wasn't looking for perfection. It was looking for her. It was a painful sweetness. It was the ache of being seen without the need to hide. It was the relief of skin against skin in a world that was mostly thorns and wire. Afterward, the silence returned, but it was heavy now. Nadie pulled the buffalo robe up to her chin. She turned away from him, curling into a ball. Elias felt the shift, the panic, the old programming kicking in, that she was damaged, that she had been used, that he would now look at her with regret. He didn't leave the bed. He didn't retreat to the floor. He shifted closer, pressing his chest against her back. He draped his arm over her waist, his hand resting flat on her stomach. "You're okay," he whispered into her hair. She was rigid. "I am here," he said. "I'm not going anywhere. You are not a mistake." He felt a shudder run through her. Then another. She was crying, silent, shaking sobs that racked her small frame. Elias just held her. He let her weep out the years of shame. He let her cry for the girl who had burned, and the woman who had been traded. He held her until the shaking stopped and her breathing deepened into sleep. The next morning, the sun was blindingly bright. Elias woke first. He lay there for a moment, remembering. He looked at Nadie. She was asleep, her face pressed into the pillow. In the light, the scars were stark, but they didn't look like a curse anymore. They just looked like history. He got up and made coffee. When she woke, she was quiet. She dressed quickly, avoiding his eyes. She put the veil back on, but she didn't pin it. She left the fabric loose. Elias poured a cup of coffee and set it on the table. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she murmured. She walked past him to get the sugar. As she passed, her hand brushed his arm. It wasn't an accident. It was a tentative, terrifying claim. Trust was not a wall they had built overnight. It was a thread, a single, fragile thread braided with fear. But it held. Elias went out to the barn. He felt different. He felt like he had something to lose now. Before, the ranch was just a duty to a dead friend. Now, it was a home. Around noon, a rider came up the road. It wasn't a vigilante. It was Frenchie, the trader, his mules laden with jingling pots. He didn't smile this time. He looked grim. Elias walked out to meet him. Nadie stood in the doorway of the cabin. "What news?" Elias asked. "Bad news." "Mon ami," Frenchie said. He spat a stream of tobacco juice. "I passed a column of bluecoats on the river road. 200 of them. Cavalry. They're early." Elias said. "They are in a hurry." Frenchie said. "They have orders to clear the Badlands. They say the raids have to stop. They say the chief has broken the treaty." He looked at the cabin, then back at Elias. "They are coming for the camp." Elias. "And they will come through here to get there." Elias looked at the horizon. The peace of the morning evaporated. The reality of their position crashed down on him. The chief would fight. He had no choice. The vigilantes would join the soldiers, and Elias was sitting in the middle, married to the enemy, holding a hand that the world wanted to crush. Frenchie kicked his mule. "Good luck, rancher. You will need it." Elias watched him go. He turned and walked back to the porch. Nadie was waiting. She had heard. "Soldiers?" she asked. "Yes, my father will die," she said. "Maybe." Elias said. She looked at him. Her eyes were steady, but he saw the question in them. "Will you run? Will you cut the rope now that the fire is coming?" Elias reached out and took her hand. He interlaced his fingers with hers, feeling the scar tissue, feeling the pulse. "We have to get the cattle in," he said. "It's going to be a long week." He wasn't going to cut himself free. He realized, with a terrifying certainty, that he would burn the whole world down before he let them take her back. "Come on," he said. They walked toward the barn together. Two small figures against the rising storm of history. The smoke from the burning homestead to the west did not rise in a clean column. It smeared across the sky like a thumbprint of greasy ash, blotting out the late afternoon sun. It was the Miller place, Jeb Miller, the man who had ridden to Elias's porch with a smile and a threat only weeks before. Elias Thorne watched the black smudge from his corral. The wind brought the smell of it to him, pine resin, scorched wool, and the heavy, sweet stench of grain burning in a silo. They will say it was the tribe. Elias said. He did not look at Nadie, who stood 10 paces behind him, near the water trough. "They always say it is the tribe," she replied. Her voice was muffled by the veil, but the tension in it was clear as a struck bell. The escalation had been swift and brutal. 2 nights ago, riders had galloped past the ranch gate. They hadn't stopped, but they had fired their pistols into the air, the flashes tearing holes in the dark. In the morning, Elias had found the words, "Devil whore," scratched into the fresh wood of a fence post with a knife. He had planed the wood smooth before Nadie could see it, but he knew she felt the hatred closing in. It was a physical pressure, like the drop in air before a hailstorm. That night, the terror came inside. Elias woke to the sound of movement. The cabin was dark, the fire banked to a low, sullen glow. He sat up, his hand automatically finding the grip of his Colt on the floorboards. Nadie was out of bed. She was walking toward the stove. She moved with a stiff, unnatural gait, her arms held out in front of her as if pushing against a heavy curtain. "No," she whispered. Her voice was thin, a child's sound, not the door, the window. Elias realized she was asleep. He rose slowly, setting the gun down. "Nadie?" She didn't hear him. She reached for the hot iron of the stove door. Her hand was inches from the metal. "The smoke," she whimpered. "It is under the door. Mama, the smoke!" Elias lunged. He caught her wrist just before her flesh touched the iron. "Nadie," he said, sharp and loud. She gasped, jerking awake with a violence that nearly threw her off balance. She stared at him, her eyes wide and unseeing for a heartbeat, pupils dilated in the gloom. Then she saw the stove. She saw Elias's grip on her arm. She collapsed. It wasn't a faint. Her legs simply gave up. Elias caught her, lowering her to the floor. She was shaking so hard her teeth clicked together. "It is here," she breathed. "I can smell it." "It is the Miller place," Elias said, holding her shoulders. "It is miles away." "No," she said, clutching his shirt. "It is inside. It is always inside." He held her until the dawn turned the window gray. She did not sleep again. The trauma was not a memory for her. It was a ghost that lived in the corners of the room, waiting for the lights to go out. 2 days later, a rider appeared on the ridge. It wasn't the vigilantes. It was a young Arapaho, barely 16, riding a rib-thin pony. He sat just out of rifle range, raising a lance with a hawk feather tied to it. "A messenger," Nadie said. She was standing on the porch, wrapped in a blanket. Elias saddled Blue. "We are going to meet him." "You go," she said. "No," Elias said. He tightened the cinch. "I am done leaving you behind." They rode out to the ridge. The boy looked at Nadie with a mixture of awe and fear, avoiding her veiled face. He spoke rapidly in the tribal tongue, his hands cutting the air with sharp gestures. "What does he say?" Elias asked. Nadie's posture stiffened. She looked at the boy, then at Elias. "He says the young men are leaving the camp at night. They are painting their faces. My father cannot hold them. They see the smoke of the white man's house, and they want to make more smoke. Tell him I know who burned the farm." Elias said, "Tell him it wasn't his people, and it wasn't the settlers. It is the men with the nailed boots, the thieves." She translated. The boy listened, his face impassive. He replied with a single, short sentence. "He says words are wind." Nadie translated. "He says if you have truth, bring it to the chief. But come now. The patience of the spear is broken." The ride to the Badlands was tense. The landscape itself seemed hostile. Sharp shale that cut the horses' hooves. Dry washes that offered no cover. When they reached the hidden camp, the mood had shifted from the despair of their first visit to a razor-edged aggression. The warriors cleaning their weapons didn't look down. They stared at Elias with open hatred. The chief sat outside his lodge. He looked older. The skin of his face hung loose, and his eyes were rimmed with red. Elias dismounted, helping Nadie down. He approached the chief, pulling a folded piece of paper from his pocket. It was a sketch he had made of the boot prints and the arrow fletching he had found. "It is a trick," Elias said without preamble. "Men from the town, criminals, are burning the farms. They are stealing the cattle. They want a war so they can take what is left of the valley." The chief looked at the paper. He didn't touch it. I know this. The chief said. Elias paused. You know, I have scouts. The chief said, I know the tracks of the men who steal. I know they are not my men. Then why do you let your warriors prepare for war? Elias demanded. If you know it is a lie, stop them. The chief looked at Nady, then back to Elias. Hunger does not listen to reason. Rancher, grief does not care about boot prints. My young men see the white men gathering. They see the hate. They want to strike first. He stood up, walking closer to Elias. I need time, the chief said. That is why I gave her to you. Elias felt a cold prickle on his neck. You gave her to me to save her. He said, to protect her from the curse. The chief let out a low, dry chuckle. It was a sound like dry leaves crushing. I gave her to you because you are a man who carries a heavy stone, the chief said. I saw it in your eyes the day you trespassed. You have the look of a man who owes a debt to the dead. Nady went very still. A guilty man is obedient, the chief continued. I knew you would not kill her. I knew you would suffer for her, because you think suffering pays your debt. And as long as you suffer, as long as you keep her, I can tell the soldiers, look, we are at peace. My daughter sleeps in a white man's house. Elias felt the air leave his lungs. You used her. You used us. I bought my people another winter, the chief said flatly. That is what a leader does. He spends lives to buy time. Elias turned to Nady. She was standing rigid, her hands clenched at her sides. She had heard every word. She had learned that her marriage wasn't a punishment for a curse, nor a desperate protection. It was a political maneuver. She was a coin spent across a counter. Nady, Elias started. She turned away from him. She didn't speak to her father. She walked to the spotted mare and mounted, sitting like a stone carving. They rode back to the ranch in a silence that was far worse than the wind. It was the silence of a bridge collapsing. When they reached the cabin, the sun was setting. The light was bleeding out of the sky, turning the grass a bruised purple. Nady went inside without waiting for him. Elias stabled the horses. He felt a restless, gnawing anxiety. The conversation with the chief had peeled back a layer of the world, revealing the cold machinery beneath. He walked to the cabin. Nady was sitting at the table, her veil removed, staring at the grain of the wood. He didn't mean it like that. Elias lied. He was trying to sound strong. He meant exactly that, she said. Her voice was ice. I am a tool, to him, to the town, to you. Not to me, Elias said. To you, she repeated, looking up. Her scars were stark in the lantern light. You took me because you felt guilty about your friend. You keep me because it makes you feel like a good man. You are washing your hands in my life. That isn't true, Elias said, though the words felt hollow. He grabbed his rifle. I'm going to check the South Ridge, he said. I saw dust there earlier. I don't trust Hatcher's men to stay away tonight. He needed to be away from her eyes. He needed the cold air. He rode out into the darkness. He patrolled the fence line for an hour, his mind churning. He thought of Caleb. He thought of the fire. He thought of the chief's words. A guilty man is obedient. He was turning blue back toward the ranch when he heard the scream. It wasn't a human scream. It was the high, tearing shriek of a horse in agony. Elias drove his spurs into Blue's flanks. The roan leaped forward, galloping through the dark. He crested the rise and saw the ranch. The door to the cabin was kicked in. A lantern had been thrown onto the porch, and the dry wood was catching. Nady! He roared. He hit the yard at a run, jumping from the saddle before the horse stopped. He sprinted to the porch, kicking the burning lantern into the dirt. The cabin was a wreck. The table was overturned. The crockery was smashed. There was blood on the floor near the stove, a smear of it, bright and wet. Nady! Silence answered him. He ran to the barn. The spotted mare was gone, but his extra saddle horse was there, shot through the neck, dying in the straw. That had been the scream. Elias stood in the center of the yard. His chest heaved. A panic, raw and animal, clawed at his throat. He spun around, looking at the dark horizon. They had her. He didn't think about the politics. He didn't think about the chief or the vigilantes. He thought about the way she covered her ear when men laughed. He thought of her hand on his face. He ran back to the cabin. He grabbed a box of cartridges and shoved them into his pockets. He grabbed his canteen. He went to the blood on the floor. He touched it. It was tacky, drying. He went outside and dropped to one knee. The lantern light showed the story in the dirt. Boot prints, nailed soles. 4 men. There were drag marks, heels digging into the earth. She had fought. Here, the dirt was churned. A struggle. He saw a scrap of gray wool, part of her dress, caught on a splinter of the doorframe. And here, in the dust, a clear impression where a hand had clawed the earth, refusing to let go. She hadn't screamed. She had bitten and clawed. Elias mounted Blue. The horse was blown, but he didn't care. He tracked them by moonlight. It was slow, agonizing work. The tracks led south, then veered sharply west, toward the Badlands. Not toward the tribal camp, but into the labyrinth of canyons where the law didn't go. 2 hours in, a shadow detached itself from the rocks. Elias leveled his rifle. "Don't shoot," a voice said. It was the boy, the messenger, Little Hawk. He stepped into the moonlight. He had a bow in his hand. "I watched them." The boy said, "Where?" Elias demanded. "The Dead Man's Canyon." Little Hawk said, "4 men. They have the firewalker. Why didn't you stop them?" Elias snapped. "4 guns," the boy said simply. "I have 2 arrows. Get on behind me," Elias said. "Show me." The boy hesitated, then swung up behind the saddle. They rode deeper into the Badlands. The terrain turned into a nightmare of twisted rock and deep shadows. The smell of sulfur and stale water hung in the air. Elias's mind was a loop of worst-case scenarios. He knew what men like that did to women they considered savages. The thought made his hands shake on the reins. He forced it down. He needed to be cold. He needed to be the predator. "Smoke," the boy whispered. They dismounted. Elias tied Blue to a scrub oak. They crept forward on foot, moving up a shale slope. Below them, in a small box canyon, a fire burned. 4 men sat around it. A bottle was being passed. Their laughter drifted up, harsh and jagged. Elias scanned the camp. He saw the horses, and then he saw her. She was tied to a wagon wheel near the back of the camp. Her veil was gone. Her hair hung in her face. Her dress was torn at the shoulder. She was slumped forward, but her head was up. She was watching them. Elias shifted his gaze to the men. The firelight hit the face of the one holding the bottle. Elias froze. It was Vance. Vance wasn't a rustler. Not just, Vance was a contractor. He had been the one who sold the bad beef to the army 3 years ago. He was the one who had insisted on moving the herd through the dry grass during the drought. The recognition hit Elias like a physical blow. This was the man who had profited while the county burned. This was the man whose greed had set the stage for the fire that killed Caleb. And now he had Nady. Elias looked at Little Hawk. "You take the horses," he whispered. "Cut them loose. When they run, I shoot." The boy nodded and slipped away into the dark like smoke. Elias rested the barrel of his Winchester on a rock. He sighted on Vance. The distance was 50 yards. An easy shot. But Vance stood up. He walked over to Nady. He grabbed her hair and pulled her head back. "Look at me, you freak!" Vance shouted, "Let's see what the rancher paid for." Nady didn't pull away. She lunged. She snapped her teeth at his hand. Vance cursed and backhanded her. The sound of the slap echoed in the canyon. Elias didn't wait for the horses. He squeezed the trigger. The rifle cracked. Vance spun around, his shoulder exploding in red mist. He didn't fall. He staggered, screaming. The canyon erupted. The other 3 men scrambled for their guns. Elias worked the lever. Clack bang! A man diving for a rifle crumpled. The horses panicked, tearing their picket lines. Little Hawk was there, shouting, waving a blanket. The herd stampeded through the camp, hooves churning the fire into sparks. Elias ran down the slope. He didn't feel the loose rock under his boots. He was sliding, falling, running. A man popped up from behind a saddle. Elias fired from the hip. The bullet kicked up dirt, missing. The man fired back. A bee stung Elias's ear, a bullet passing inches away. Elias dropped to a knee. He took a breath. He aimed. Bang! The man fell back. One left. Plus Vance. Elias moved through the smoke and dust. The smell of gunpowder was acrid, mixing with the metallic scent of blood. He reached the wagon wheel. Vance was there, on the ground, clutching his shoulder. He was trying to lift a pistol with his left hand. Elias kicked the gun away. He stepped on Vance's chest. "Don't!" Vance wheezed. "I know you. Thorn! I know you!" Elias looked down at him. There was no mercy in him. None. He looked at Nadie. She was staring at him. Her lip was split. Her eye was swelling. But her gaze was clear. She was watching to see what he would do. Elias lowered the rifle. He drew his knife. He cut Nadie's ropes. She fell forward into his arms. She smelled of sweat and fear and the whiskey Vance had spilled on her. "Can you ride?" Elias asked. She nodded against his chest. He helped her up. Little Hawk appeared leading two of the rustlers' horses. "What about him?" Little Hawk asked, pointing at Vance. Vance groaned. "Thorn, help me. I'm bleeding out." Elias looked at the man who had helped burn his world twice. "The law can have him," Elias said. "If he lives that long." He hoisted Nadie onto a horse. He mounted the other. They rode out of the canyon, leaving Vance screaming in the dark. They didn't stop until they were miles away, on a high plateau where the wind scoured the air clean. Elias helped Nadie down. She sat on a rock, wrapping her torn dress around herself. She was shaking now. The adrenaline was fading, leaving the cold reality of the violence. Elias found a canteen on the saddle. He wet a handkerchief and gently wiped the blood from her lip. She flinched. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry." She looked at him. The moon was bright. She didn't hide her face. "You knew him." She said, "The man with the gun." "Yes," Elias admitted. "His name is Vance. He was a partner of the man I worked with years ago, before the fire." Nadie closed her eyes. "The fire that took my face," she said softly. "It wasn't an accident." Elias stopped wiping her face. "It wasn't a cooking fire." She continued. "It was the traders. They came to the camp. They had whiskey. They had guns. They wanted the furs, but they didn't want to pay. A fight started. Someone threw a lamp. The lodge went up." She opened her eyes. They were wet. "My father blamed the spirits. He blamed me. But it was just men, greedy men." Elias felt a stone drop in his stomach. He knew the timeline. He knew the story. "Vance," Elias said, his voice hollowing out. 3 years ago, he had a contract for furs. He took a wagon train out. He came back saying the Indians attacked him. He demanded the army go in. He looked at Nadie, seeing the horror of the connection. I was the scout." Elias whispered. Nadie went still. "I guided the soldiers." Elias said, I thought we were going to arrest the men who attacked Vance. I didn't know Vance started it. I led them to the camp. The soldiers, they didn't ask questions. They started shooting. The confusion, the fires." He looked at his hands. "I didn't light the match, Nadie, but I showed them where the wood was." The silence on the plateau was absolute. The wind stopped. The coyotes stopped. Nadie looked at him. She looked at the man who had saved her life tonight, and the man who had helped destroy it 3 years ago. She didn't scream. She didn't scratch his face. She went cold. It was a terrifying transformation. Her face became a mask, smoother and harder than stone. "You led them." She said, "It wasn't a question." "I didn't know," Elias pleaded. "I swear to God, I didn't know. But you were there." She said, "Yes." She stood up. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. She looked out at the vast, dark emptiness of the west. "Take me back," she said. "Nadie, take me back to the ranch." She said. Her voice was dead. Elias wanted to beg. He wanted to explain the complexity of it, the fog of war, the lies Vance had told, but he looked at her scars, the physical map of his failure, and the words died in his throat. Love couldn't erase this. Saving her tonight didn't balance the scale of 3 years of agony. "Okay," he said. They rode back to the ranch in the gray light of dawn. The cabin was still there, the door broken, the porch stained with soot. They walked inside. Elias set the chair upright. Nadie sat down. She looked at the wall. Elias stood by the door. "You are free," he said. She didn't look at him. "I mean it." He said, "The chief. He sold you. I failed you. You don't owe anyone anything anymore. If you want to go, I will give you a horse and money. If you want to stay, the house is yours." "And you?" she asked. "I will sleep in the barn," he said. "Until you decide." She didn't answer. She just sat there, a broken woman in a broken house, while the sun rose on a world that seemed determined to crush them both. Elias walked out to the porch. He looked at the horizon. The soldiers were coming. The vigilantes were coming. And now, the truth was here. He had saved her life, but he had lost her. And as the morning wind hit his face, he realized he didn't want to leave. He didn't want to run. He was cracked open, his guilt laid bare, but for the first time in his life, he knew exactly what he was fighting for. He sat on the step, put his rifle across his knees, and waited for the war to come. The ledger sat on the rough-hewn table between them, a small book bound in black leather that smelled of mildew and dried blood. It was a damning thing, filled with columns of numbers that didn't add up, sales of cattle that didn't exist, payments to men who had officially left the territory, and notes on herd movements that mirrored the recent raids perfectly. Elias Thorne stared at the book. His hands were wrapped around a tin cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. Across the table, Nadie watched him. Her face was bare in the safety of the cabin, the scars on her right cheek catching the gray morning light that filtered through the cracks in the shutter. "We cannot just give this to the sheriff," Elias said. "Sheriff Brady is a man who likes his elections quiet. He will burn this book and tell us to go home before we cause trouble." "Then what do we do?" Nadie asked. Her voice was steady, though her hands were clenched in her lap. "We make it so he cannot look away." Elias said, "We go to town. We go when the court is in session. We put this book, and the branding iron, and the truth on the table in front of everyone." Nadie looked toward the window. Going to town meant being seen. It meant walking into the teeth of the wolf. "They will stare," she said. "They will call me names." "They will," Elias admitted. He did not offer false comfort. "They will call you everything they have called you before. But hiding has not saved us. Silence has not saved us." He reached across the table, his hand hovering over hers but not touching, giving her the space to decide. "If we do this, there is no going back," he said. "We declare ourselves. To the town, to the tribe, to the army. We become the enemy of everyone who wants this war." Nadie looked at the ledger. She thought of the men in the canyon, the smell of whiskey and hate, and the way Vance had looked at her as if she were livestock. She touched the scar on her face, a habit that usually signaled retreat, but this time her fingers pressed into the skin as if testing its strength. "I am tired of hiding," she said. "Then we ride," Elias said. They spent the morning gathering the proof. The ledger was the heart of it, but there was more. Elias went to the barn and retrieved the running iron they had found in the rustlers' camp, a straight rod used to alter brands in the field. He wrapped it in burlap. He took the statement he had written down from the trembling lips of his young ranch hand. Grady, who had finally admitted to seeing Hatcher's men driving cattle that weren't theirs near the canyon. They saddled the horses. The wind was biting, carrying the sharp scent of pine and impending snow. The landscape they rode through was a testament to the indifference of the West. Great spires of red rock jutted into a sky so wide it felt like it could swallow a scream without an echo. It was beautiful, but it was a cruel beauty, the kind that demanded strength just to stand upright. As they neared Bitter Creek, the tension tightened between them. Elias checked his Colt, ensuring it was loose in the holster. Nadie pulled her veil down, securing it tightly. She sat straight in the saddle, her posture rigid. They rode down the main street at noon. The town was busy. Wagons churned the mud into a thick paste. Men shouted from the livery. But as Elias and the veiled woman passed, the noise seemed to bleed away, replaced by a ripple of silence that followed them like a wake. Heads turned. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. A woman sweeping a boardwalk froze, broom in hand, and watched them with eyes hard as flint. "Look at that," A voice drifted from the saloon porch. The squaw man and his witch. Elias stared straight ahead. His jaw locked so tight a muscle jumped in his cheek. He felt the insults landing on Nady. Invisible stones meant to bruise. Savage, cursed, monster. They dismounted in front of the sheriff's office. Elias tied the horses, his back providing a wall between Nady and the street. "Head up," he murmured to her. She nodded, invisible behind the wool. Sheriff Brady was sitting at his desk, cleaning his fingernails with a knife. He was a man of comfortable girth and uncomfortable compromises, who had kept his badge for 10 years by knowing exactly which crimes to solve and which to ignore. He looked up as they entered, his face souring. "Thorne," he said, "I thought I told you to keep your domestic troubles out at the ranch." "This isn't domestic," Elias said, throwing the ledger onto the desk. It hit the wood with a heavy thud. "And it isn't trouble I made." Brady looked at the book, then at Nady. He didn't offer her a chair. "What is this?" Brady asked. "That is the account book of Vance and his partners," Elias said. "It proves they have been stealing stock for 2 years. It proves they staged the raids to look like the Arapaho. And the branding iron in this bag matches the altered marks on the calves I found." Brady didn't open the book. He sighed. A long, weary sound. "Vance is dead. Thorne. Someone shot him in the Badlands. I heard you had a hand in that. I shot him because he had kidnapped my wife," Elias said, his voice dropping to a dangerous rumble. "And he wasn't working alone. Hatcher is in that book. Half the Vigilance Committee is in that book." Brady leaned back. "You're making wild accusations. Elias, you're trying to stir up a hornet's nest to protect your investments." He nodded toward Nady. "People are saying you've been bewitched," Brady said. "They say you're betraying your own race for a piece of tail that's half burned off." Elias moved so fast Brady flinched. Elias placed both hands on the desk, leaning in until he could smell the stale tobacco on the sheriff's breath. "You are going to take this evidence," Elias said. "You are going to the judge, and you are going to hold a hearing, because if you don't, I will take this book to the Army commander at Fort Robinson, and I will tell him that the sheriff of Bitter Creek is an accessory to treason." Brady stared at him. He saw the desperation in Elias's eyes, and the reckless resolve. "Judge Holloway is at the courthouse," Brady muttered. "But I warn you, Thorne, you walk in there, you might not walk out." The courthouse was a drafty building that smelled of dry paper and wet wool. Judge Holloway, a man with a face like a dried apple and a temper to match, sat behind a raised bench. He looked at Elias and Nady with open disdain. The room filled quickly. News traveled faster than wind in Bitter Creek. By the time Elias laid the evidence on the prosecutor's table, the benches were packed. Hatcher was there, sitting in the front row, his arms crossed, a smirk playing on his lips. The preacher was there. The men from the saloon were there. It felt less like a court and more like an arena. "State your business," the judge said, banging his gavel to silence the murmurs. Elias stood. He looked small in the large room, his clothes dusty, his face haggard. "We are here to present evidence of a conspiracy," Elias said. The judge looked at Nady. "And who is this?" "This is the witness," Elias said. "She needs to remove that covering." The judge said, "The court must see the face of the one who speaks." "She is injured." Elias said, "The law requires identification." The judge snapped, "Take it off or get out." Nady stood up. She reached for the veil. Her hands were shaking, but she did not hesitate. She unpinned the cloth and let it fall to the table. A collective gasp went through the room. It was a sound of revulsion and fascination. People leaned forward to see the ruin of her face, the tightened skin, the missing ear, the map of fire. Hatcher laughed, a short, cruel bark. "God Almighty," he said. "No wonder she hides." Elias took a step toward Hatcher, but Nady placed a hand on his arm. She looked at the judge. She looked at the crowd. She did not look down. "I need words," she said. Her English was broken by fear. "I can help," a voice said from the back. A woman stood up. It was Marie, a laundress of mixed French and Cree descent who lived on the edge of town. She was ignored by polite society. But she walked forward now with a dignity that silenced the room. "I will translate," Marie said. The judge waved a dismissive hand. "Get on with it." Nady spoke. She spoke in a mix of Arapaho and English, her voice gaining strength as Marie repeated her words. She told them about the night of the kidnapping. She described the boots of the men. She described the brands she had seen them altering in the canyon light. "They called me monster," Nady said, and Marie translated the words into a clear, ringing English. "But monsters do not need to hide their faces. These men wore masks. They stole from their own neighbors and blamed my father's people because they knew you would believe it. They knew you hate us more than you love the truth." "Lies!" Hatcher shouted, standing up. "She's a savage. She's trying to save her skin." "Sit down," the judge roared. Elias took the stand next. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked at the ledger. "I found this on Vance." Elias said, "It details the theft of 300 head over 2 years. It shows payments to Hatcher for protection." He looked up, meeting the eyes of the townspeople. "But there is more." Elias said, "Hatcher says I am betraying my people. He says I am protecting the tribe because I am bewitched." He took a deep breath. The air in the room felt thin. "I am protecting the tribe because I owe them," Elias said. 3 years ago, I was the scout who led the soldiers to the camp at Sandy Creek. I was the one who listened to Vance's lies about being attacked. I led the cavalry to a sleeping village. The room went dead silent. This was an old wound, a dark rumor that nobody spoke of. "I watched the fires," Elias said. "I watched women and children burn because I didn't ask enough questions. I carry the guilt of that night every day, and I will not let another massacre happen because of another lie told by the same men." He pointed at the ledger. "This isn't about Indian or white," Elias said. "It is about a thief who wants a war so he can steal the land in the confusion. And if you follow him, you are not patriots. You are fools." The silence held for a heartbeat, and then it broke. Not into applause, but into chaos. "Traitor!" someone shouted. "Indian lover!" Hatcher was pushing his way toward the front. The sheriff was trying to hold back the crowd. The judge was banging his gavel, but the sound was lost in the roar. Elias grabbed the ledger and the branding iron. He grabbed Nady's arm. "We have to go," he said. They pushed their way toward the side exit. A man lunged at Elias, grabbing his coat. Elias shoved him back hard. Another man spit at Nady. She didn't flinch. She kept moving, her eyes fixed on the door. Outside, the air was cold and clean. They scrambled onto their horses just as the doors of the courthouse burst open. "Ride!" Elias shouted. They galloped out of town, the shouts of the mob fading behind them. They didn't stop until the buildings of Bitter Creek were small smudges against the mountains. Back at the ranch, the adrenaline crashed. Elias barred the door. He checked the shutters. He lit the lamp, his hands trembling slightly. They were safe, for the moment, but the world had shifted. There was no going back to the uneasy truce of before. They were marked now. Nady sat on the edge of the bed. She had not put the veil back on. She looked exhausted, her skin pale, the scars standing out in sharp relief. "You told them," she said softly. "About the soldiers." "I had to," Elias said. "It was the only way to make them understand. They will hate you for it," she said. "Let them hate me," Elias said. "I am done trying to be a neighbor to men I don't respect." He walked over to her. He stood in front of her, looking down. "You were brave," he said. "I was terrified," she corrected. "That is what brave means," Elias said. He reached out and touched her hair. It was a tentative gesture, asking permission. She didn't pull away. She leaned her head slightly against his hip. The atmosphere in the cabin changed. The violence of the day, the shouting, the hate, it all seemed to strip away the layers of reserve they had kept between them. They were two soldiers who had survived a battle, and the relief was a physical ache. Nady stood up. She looked at him, her eyes searching his face. "You stood beside me," she said. "You did not stand in front of me like an owner. You stood beside me. That is where I belong," Elias said. She reached for the buttons of her dress. Her fingers were steady now. She undid the top button, then the second. She let the dress slide from her shoulders. Elias watched her. He didn't move. He let her choose the pace. Underneath, she wore a simple chemise. Her arms were scarred, the burn tissue wrapping around her shoulder like a vine. She stepped out of the dress. She looked at him, defenseless and defiant at the same time. "See me?" she whispered. "All of it." Elias stepped closer. He reached out and touched the scar on her shoulder. His fingers were rough, calloused from work, but his touch was light as a feather. He traced the line of the injury, acknowledging the pain she had carried. He cupped her face in his hands. He looked at the ruined side, the tight skin, the missing ear. He didn't see a monster. He saw the woman who had tracked rustlers in the mud. He saw the woman who had swung an axe to keep them warm. "You are beautiful," he said. It wasn't a line from a book. It was a statement of fact. She let out a sound that was half sob, half laugh. She pulled him down to the bed. This time, there was no darkness to hide in. The lamp was burning. They made love with their eyes open, watching each other. It wasn't frantic like before. It was slow. It was a conversation without words. When he kissed her scars, she didn't flinch. She pressed into him, claiming the pleasure that had been denied to her for so long. It was a reclaiming of territory. Her body was no longer a site of tragedy. It was her own. They lay together afterward, the fire popping in the stove. Elias ran his hand down her back, feeling the rise and fall of her breath. "We cannot stay here forever," he said quietly. "Hatcher won't stop." "I know," she said. A heavy pounding on the door shattered the peace. Elias was up in an instant, the Colt in his hand. Nadie pulled the blanket up, her eyes wide. "Who is it?" Elias called. A voice answered from the dark. "It wasn't Hatcher. It was Frenchie. Open up. Elias, it is urgent." Elias unbarred the door. Frenchie slipped inside, shaking snow from his coat. He looked anxious, his eyes darting to the rifle on the rack. "You stirred up a hornet's nest today. My friend," Frenchie said, "tell me something I don't know." Elias said. Frenchie moved to the table. "I have word from the camp. A runner came to me. The chief. He is done waiting." "What does that mean?" Elias asked. "The army has sent an ultimatum," Frenchie said. "Surrender the guns and move to the reservation in Oklahoma, or be declared hostiles. The chief has refused. He says he will die in the mountains before he walks to another prison." Elias swore softly. "And there is more," Frenchie said. "The soldiers are moving. Major Trent is leading a column up the South Pass. They will be at the camp in 2 days." "Major Trent?" Elias asked. "I don't know him. He is new," Frenchie said. "They say he is a hard man, but a rule-book man. He follows the law." Elias looked at Nadie. She had dressed quickly and was standing by the fire. "The law," Elias said bitterly. "The law just tried to throw us out of court. Hatcher is gathering men to ride with the soldiers," Frenchie warned. "He wants to make sure there are no survivors to testify against him." Frenchie left as quickly as he had come, disappearing into the snow. Elias stood by the door. He felt the weight of the moral cliff he was standing on. "If I stay here," Elias said, looking at the floor, "we might survive. We can board up the windows and wait for the storm to pass." "But my father will die," Nadie said, "and the truth about Hatcher and the rustlers will die with him." Elias turned to her. "And if we go, if we try to intervene, Hatcher will shoot us in the back. The soldiers might shoot us as traitors." Nadie walked over to the table where the ledger still lay. "This Major Trent," she said. "Frenchie said he follows the book. Yeah, if he follows the book. Then he cannot ignore this." She tapped the ledger. "If he sees that the raids were faked, if he sees that the war he is coming to fight is a lie, maybe he stops. It's a long shot." Elias said, "A suicide run. We are already dead if we stay." Nadie said, "If Hatcher wins, he will come for this ranch next. He will come for me." She looked at him, her eyes fierce. "I want to choose how I die." "Elias." Elias looked at her. He saw the fire in her. He realized that she was right. There was no safety in silence. There was only the slow suffocation of waiting for the end. "We go to the Major," Elias decided. They packed quickly. They took the ledger, the branding iron, and every cartridge they had. They left the ranch knowing they might never see it again. They rode through the night, cutting across the Badlands to intercept the army column. The snow was falling harder now, erasing their tracks as they rode, as if the land were trying to wipe them from existence. They found the column the next morning. It was a snake of blue wool and steel winding through the valley. Elias rode down the slope, his hands high in the air, holding a white handkerchief. Nadie rode beside him, her veil back in place, a ghost returning to the world of men. Soldiers shouted. Carbines clicked. A sergeant spurred his horse forward to block them. "Halt! State your business. I need to speak to Major Trent," Elias shouted over the wind. "I have evidence of a crime." "You're interfering with a military operation," the sergeant barked. "Turn back or we fire. I am Elias Thorne," Elias yelled. "I was a scout for the 3rd Cavalry. I am not a hostile." A man on a large bay horse rode up from the center of the column. He wore the oak leaves of a major. He had a face carved from granite and eyes that missed nothing. "Let them through." "Sergeant," the major said. Elias and Nadie rode up to the officer. Elias handed him the ledger. "What is this?" Major Trent asked. "It's the reason you are here," Elias said. "It's the proof that the raids you are punishing were committed by white men, by the very men who asked for your help." The major opened the book. He looked at the pages. He looked at Hatcher's name. He looked at the dates. He looked at Nadie. "And her?" the major asked. "She is the witness," Elias said, "and she is my wife." The major studied them for a long moment. He was a man of the book. As Frenchie had said, he hated disorder. And this ledger was the definition of disorder. "Sergeant," the major said, closing the book, "send a detachment to Bitter Creek. Arrest these men listed here. Bring them to me." He looked at Elias. "This doesn't change the orders regarding the tribe. Mr. Thorne, they must still surrender." "I know," Elias said, "but at least now, you know who the real enemy is." The part ended with a fragile, jagged victory. As the detachment rode off toward town to arrest the rustlers, Elias and Nadie sat on their horses, watching the gray sky. They had bought a moment of truth. They had exposed the lie. But the column of soldiers was still moving toward the camp. The machinery of removal had not stopped. The hatred that drove Hatcher was not extinguished, only paused. Elias reached out and took Nadie's hand. Her fingers were cold, but her grip was strong. "It isn't over," she said. "No," Elias said, "it's just beginning." They turned their horses to follow the column, riding not as guides, but as witnesses, determined to stand between the fire and the people it was meant to consume. The winter did not wait for the politics of men to settle. It came down from the peaks with a vengeance, turning the sky the color of a bruised plum. The wind, which had been a constant companion all autumn, sharpened into a blade that sought out every crack in the cabin walls. Elias Thorne stood by the corral, breaking the ice on the water trough with the butt of his rifle. The sound was a dull, hollow thud in the frozen air. The victory with the ledger and Major Trent felt like a dream now, distant and fragile. The reality was the cold, and the wolves that had grown bold enough to come within shooting distance of the barn, their eyes reflecting the lantern light like coins. Inside the cabin, the mood was brittle. Nadie moved through the small space with a restless energy. She kept the shutters barred. She checked the load in the spare pistol 3 times a day. "It feels wrong," she said, stopping by the stove. "It is too quiet." "Hatcher is in a cell," Elias said, though he didn't believe the comfort of his own words. "And the major has his orders. A wolf does not stop hunting because you put it in a cage," Nadie said. "It just waits for the door to open." She was right. 2 days later, the door opened. Frenchie arrived at dawn, his mule lathered despite the cold. He didn't dismount. He shouted from the yard, his breath pluming in the gray light. "Elias, get your gun!" Elias ran out, buttoning his coat. Nadie was right behind him, a blanket thrown over her shoulders, her face unveiled in the urgency of the moment. "What happened?" Elias asked. "They are out." Frenchie spat. "Sheriff Brady let them go. Said there was a mistake in the paperwork. Said the ledger was inadmissible without a signature." "And the major?" "The major is 10 miles up the canyon, waiting for the chief to surrender. Frenchie said, "He doesn't know. He thinks Hatcher is locked up." Elias felt the blood drain from his face. "Where is Hatcher?" Frenchie pointed west, toward the pass that led to the high grazing grounds. "There is a wagon train coming through," Frenchie said. "Settlers, families. Hatcher and his men rode out an hour ago. They are wearing paint. Elias, they are wearing buckskins. They are going to stage a massacre," Nadi said. Her voice was cold and flat. "Yes," Frenchie said. "They will slaughter the wagons. The army will hear the gunfire. They will ride in and see painted men killing women. And then Major Trent will have no choice but to wipe out the camp." It was the final play. A desperate, bloody gamble to force a war that would clear the land once and for all. Elias looked at Nadi. He saw the terror in her eyes, the memory of fire and screaming. But he also saw the steel that had been forged in that same fire. "We have to stop them," Elias said. "We cannot fight 20 men," Frenchie warned. "We don't have to fight them," Elias said. "We just have to make sure they are seen." They saddled the horses in a frenzy. Elias took every round of ammunition he had. Nadi tied her veil tight. Not out of shame this time, but for the hard riding ahead. They split up at the fork in the river. Frenchie rode for the army column to find Major Trent. Elias and Nadi rode for the Badlands, hoping to intercept the chief before his warriors took the bait. The ride was a nightmare of sliding shale and icy mud. They pushed the horses until their lungs heaved. When they reached the camp, the tension was at a breaking point. The women were packing travois. The men were mounted, their faces grim. Elias rode straight to the chief. The old leader sat on his war horse, looking at the smoke rising in the distance, the signal fire Hatcher's men had likely lit to draw them out. "Do not ride," Elias shouted. "It is a trap." The chief looked down. His face was a mask of exhaustion. "They are killing people on the pass," the chief said. "If we do not stop them, the soldiers will blame us. If we do go, the soldiers will blame us. I would rather die fighting than die waiting." "It is Hatcher," Elias yelled. "They are dressed as your men. If you ride down there now, you give them exactly what they want. You give them a war." The chief looked at Nadi. She sat on her spotted mare, wind whipping her cloak. "Father," she said. Her voice was loud, carrying over the murmurs of the warriors. The chief stiffened. She had not spoken to him directly since the day she learned of his betrayal. "Father, look at me," she said. "I see you. Daughter, no," she said. "You see a curse. You see a treaty. You see a tool. Look at me." She did not remove the veil, but she sat up, expanding her presence until she seemed taller than the warriors around her. "I am done being your symbol," she said. "I am done being the ghost you sell to buy time. Hatcher wants you to be a savage. He wants you to be the monster he tells his children about. If you ride down there and kill, you become his creature." "Then what do we do?" a young warrior shouted. "Watch them take everything?" "No," Elias said, stepping his horse between the chief and the path. "We ride down there, but we do not ride to kill. We ride to reveal." The wagon train was strung out along the narrow floor of the Split Rock Pass. It was a modest group, 6 wagons, canvas flapping in the biting wind, families huddled against the cold. The attack began with a howl that was meant to sound tribal but carried the rough, throat-tearing edge of whiskey-drunk men. From the rocks above, figures descended. They were painted with red and black stripes. They wore feathers. But they moved heavily, their boots slipping on the stone, their rifles barking with the dull rhythm of army repeaters, not the sharp crack of trade muskets. Bullets tore through the canvas. A horse screamed and went down. Settlers returned fire from beneath the wagons, panic making their aim wild. Elias and Nadi crested the ridge overlooking the pass. Below them, the chaos was unfolding. "The army!" Elias shouted, pointing east. A column of blue was riding hard up the valley floor, drawn by the sound of gunfire. Major Trent was leading them. "They are too far away to see the faces," Nadi said. "They only see the paint. Then we have to get closer," Elias said. He looked at her. "This is it, Nadi." She nodded. She reached into her saddlebag and pulled out the branding iron, the heavy, rusted rod they had taken from the court. She held it like a scepter. "Let's go," she said. They spurred their horses down the slope. It was a suicidal charge, sliding through scree and snow, heading straight into the crossfire. Elias fired his Winchester into the air, 3 rapid shots. "Stop!" he roared. "Stop firing!" The settlers didn't listen. They saw 2 more riders coming from the Badlands and assumed it was a second wave. A bullet whined past Elias's head. They hit the valley floor. Elias rode straight for the lead wagon, waving his hat. "I'm Elias Thorne," he screamed. "Look at the men! Look at their boots!" The attacking warriors saw him. Hatcher, watching from behind a boulder, stood up. He was wearing a war bonnet that looked ridiculous on his wide, red head. "Kill him!" Hatcher shouted to his men. "Kill the traitor!" Bullets kicked up snow around Blue's hooves. And then the real warriors arrived. The chief led them. They did not charge with a war cry. They rode in a line, silent and disciplined, lining the ridge above the fight. They held their fire. The sight of 50 mounted Arapaho froze the battlefield. The settlers stopped shooting, staring up in terror. Hatcher's men hesitated, caught between their victims and the real thing. Major Trent's column thundered into the gap, forming a line between the wagons and the ridge. "Prepare to fire!" the major shouted, his saber drawn. "No!" The scream came from the center of the killing ground. Nadie rode her spotted mare into the empty space between the soldiers, the settlers, and the fake warriors. She stopped. The wind tore at her clothes. She dropped the reins. She reached up with both hands, and she tore the veil from her head. She threw it into the mud. For the first time, she did not flinch. She turned her head slowly, letting the soldiers see, letting the settlers see, letting Hatcher see. She showed them the melted ear, the tightened jaw, the skin that shone like wax. "Look at me!" she screamed. Her voice broke, raw and terrified, but it cut through the wind. She pointed the branding iron at Hatcher. "This is the face of your fire!" she cried. She turned to the major. "Look at them! Major!" she shouted, pointing at the painted men who were now trying to scramble back into the rocks. "Look at their feet! Look at their saddles!" Major Trent lowered his saber slightly. He squinted. He saw the spurred cavalry boots on the Indian nearest him. He saw the saddlebag stamped with the U.N. "Army issue mark? Hold fire," the major ordered. Hatcher saw the tide turning. He saw the noose tightening. Panic, hot and irrational, seized him. He raised his rifle, aiming not at the soldiers, but at the woman who was unmaking his world. "You witch!" Hatcher screamed. Elias saw the barrel rise. "Nadie!" Elias launched himself from his saddle. He didn't think. He didn't calculate. He just threw his body across the gap. The rifle cracked. Elias hit the ground hard, rolling in the snow. He felt a burning sting in his side, but he scrambled up, tackling Hatcher just as the man cocked the lever for a second shot. They went down in a tangle of limbs and snow. It wasn't a heroic duel. It was ugly. Hatcher was stronger, heavier. He smashed a fist into Elias's face. Elias clawed at Hatcher's eyes, desperate, feral. They rolled into the mud. Hatcher got his hands around Elias's throat. His painted face was a mask of insanity. "I'll kill you!" Hatcher grunted. "I'll kill you all!" A shadow fell over them. Hatcher looked up. The chief stood there. He had ridden down from the ridge. He didn't have a gun. He held a lance, the tip resting gently on Hatcher's chest. "Enough," the chief said. The word was quiet, but it carried the weight of a mountain. Hatcher froze. He looked at the chief, the savage he had mimicked, the enemy he had demonized, and he saw a man who looked at him not with anger, but with a profound, weary pity. "Get up," the chief said. Hatcher released Elias. He scrambled backward, looking for his men, but his men were on their knees, surrounded by cavalry troopers who had finally seen the truth. Elias sat up, gasping for air. He clutched his side. His hand came away red, but it was a graze, a flesh wound. He looked for Nadie. She was still on her horse. She was shaking now, the adrenaline fading, but her head was bare. The wind blew her hair across her scarred cheek. She looked at the settlers peering out from the wagons. A woman, a mother holding a baby, stared at Nadie. She saw the scars. She saw the branding iron, and slowly. She lowered her gaze in shame. Major Trent rode up to Hatcher. He looked down at the paint, the feathers, the white skin beneath. "Arrest him," the major said. Soldiers dragged Hatcher away. He was shouting, cursing, blaming the government, blaming the tribe, blaming the weather. But nobody was listening. The scheme had collapsed. The lie was dead. But as the dust settled, the silence that followed was not one of celebration. Major Trent rode over to the chief. He saluted stiffly. "You showed restraint," the major said. "I showed you the truth," the chief replied. The major nodded. He looked at the wagons, then at the Badlands. "My orders stand. Chief, you must surrender your arms. You must move to the reservation." Elias struggled to his feet. "You can't do that," Elias rasped. "You just saw. They were innocent. Hatcher was the one attacking." "I know, Mr. Thorne," the major said, "and Hatcher will hang for it. But the policy comes from Washington. The land is open for settlement. The tribe must go." The injustice of it hit Elias like a physical blow. They had won the truth, but they had lost the world. The chief looked at the mountains one last time. He looked at his warriors, young men who wanted to fight but had followed him into peace. "We will go," the chief said. "We will not die here for a white man's map." He turned his horse. He looked at Nady. He didn't speak. He simply raised his hand, palm out, a gesture of release, a gesture of farewell. Nady raised her hand in return. The chief rode back to his people. The warriors turned and faded into the Badlands, beginning the long, slow death march toward Oklahoma. The aftermath was a blur of cold and pain. Elias and Nady rode back to the ranch. The sun was setting, casting long, bloody shadows across the snow. The ranch was still standing, but it felt different. It felt temporary. The fence was cut. The barn door was hanging off its hinges. The town of Bitter Creek was only a few miles away, but the distance felt infinite. They would never be welcome there. The townspeople might accept Hatcher's guilt, but they would never forgive Elias for exposing it. They would never forgive Nady for forcing them to look at her scars. They entered the cabin. It was freezing. Elias lit the stove, his movements slow and pained. Nady sat at the table. She touched her face. She had ridden all the way back without the veil. "Are you hurting?" she asked, looking at his side. "It'll heal," Elias said. He sat down opposite her. He looked at the woman he had married at gunpoint, the woman he had saved, and who had saved him. "They are leaving tomorrow," she said. "My father, the people, I know." Elias said, "I cannot go with them." She said, I do not belong in the lodge anymore. I have seen too much, and they look at me as the one who brought the soldiers. Even if I saved them, and you cannot stay here," Elias said. "No," she said, "this valley has too many ghosts." She looked at him. Her gaze was direct, stripped of all artifice. "I will not be owned, Elias, not by the tribe, not by the government, and not by you." Elias reached across the table. He took her hand. "I don't want to own you, Nady. I never did." "Then what do we do?" she asked. "We pack," Elias said. The next morning, the sky was a brilliant, hard blue. They loaded the wagon. They took the tools, the blankets, the seed corn. They took the horses. Elias left the deed to the ranch on the table, weighed down by a stone. Let the bank have it. Let the wind have it. They rode out of the gate at noon. They did not look back at Bitter Creek. They did not look back at the Badlands where the dust of the departing tribe hung in the air. They turned their horses west, toward the territories that were still blank on the map, toward Oregon, perhaps, or the high desert of Nevada, a place where nobody knew the story of the cursed daughter and the guilty rancher. They rode side by side, not touching, but close enough that their stirrups bumped occasionally. Elias looked at her. She was wearing a hat now, pulled low, but her face was uncovered. The scars were there, white and silver in the sun. She caught him looking. She didn't look away. She smiled, a small, weary, genuine smile. The road ahead was steep. The snow was deep. Danger was a constant companion in this country. But as they crested the final ridge and looked out at the vast, indifferent horizon, Elias realized that for the first time in his life, he wasn't running from the fire. He was walking out of it, scarred and alive, with the only person on earth who understood what it meant to burn. He nudged Blue forward. "Ready?" he asked. Nadie took a deep breath of the cold. "Clean air. Ready," she said. They rode on, two small figures against the immense scale of the West, disappearing into the white silence of the future. Thank you for listening to this story of the Wild West. It is a tale of survival, of scars that we carry on the outside and the inside, and the hard road to finding peace in a land that offered very little of it. I would love to know where you are listening from today. Please leave a comment below and share your location. If this story moved you, or if you enjoy tales from the American frontier, please subscribe to From Wild West for more. I invite you to share your thoughts on Elias and Nadie's journey in the comments. Did they make the right choice? Until next time, keep your eyes on the horizon.